Good morning, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and I hope you are all doing very well today. We're here to talk about War of the Spark. We're here to talk about the new spoilers, and for those of you who might just be stumbling upon this content looking for more generalized War of the Spark discussion, we wear our black and green tinted glasses on this channel, so we are talking about things as they impact Goalgari midrange and modern, BG the Rock, whatever you want to call the deck, our black-green midrange deck. So, that's what we're in for. We're going to talk about a couple things that don't quite make the cut that I think you should avoid, and then 3 cards that I think do potentially make the cut. So, before we get into it, we're going to thank a brand new patron. Between when I uploaded my Goalgari Highlander video last night, which was a heck of a lot of fun, you should really check that out, and now we have a brand new patron, so it's Ken. No last name given. Ken, like Ken from Street Fighter, right? So, Ken is an Inquisitor. Thank you so much, my friend, for supporting the content. And remember, everybody out there, if you like this content, that is the very best way to help it grow. So, without further ado, let's talk about War of the Spark. So, like I said, my friends, we're going to talk about a few that don't quite make the grade first, and we'll begin with a very cool card, Storev Devar Kinloch. Like, I love everything about this card, from the heavily Goalgari casting cost to the awesome type line, legendary creature, zombie, elf, wizard, to the art, to the abilities, to the flavor text. This is just Goalgari top to bottom. Here's the problem. It does not really do anything for our deck that we don't already do. Now, granted, do we have a trampler? No. So we can get chump blocked by tokens. Do we have this exact type of recursion? No. So I don't mean that literally, but practically, what this card does is he's a big bomb that you have to tap out for on turn 4 at the earliest, and then from there, he is going to get you grindy recursive value on a conditional basis. So you can imagine the best case scenario for Storev, where it's just like, it's turn 12 of a mid-range mirror and both players are in top deck mode and you top deck this card, the opponent top decks a land, you're off to the races. You're hitting for 5, you're buying back your best creature, Planeswalker. You can't really lose from there, can you? Well, that's true, but if you compare this card to what our other cards are doing, we have Dark Confidant that, beginning on turn 3, draws you an extra card per turn. We have Tarmogoyf, which is a simple clocker and blocker, but is the most efficient one this side of Death Shadow in the format. We have Scavenging Ooze that disrupts opposing strategies. We have Tireless Tracker that once again accrues real card advantage, often immediately after casting her. And then we have Kalitas. Now, Kalitas is the most similar to Storev, but Kalitas even, you can, in theory, get more or less immediate value out of Kalitas if you play Kalitas on turn 5 or 6 with removal to be backed up with. Now, again, Kalitas does have that conditional the value is conditional, and it's a 4-drop, so that's the most common comparison you could make. But Storev is trampling over tokens, basically, or defensive weenies, and is buying back threats from the graveyard. So Storev shines against token decks and against mid-range decks, whereas Kalitas shines against burn and against graveyard decks, and the latter two are definitely more common in the format right now than the former two. So Storev, you could definitely play this card as a fun of. It's kind of sometimes a matter of winning with any threat once we get our disruption to line up. So in that sense, sure, this is playable as a fun card, but as a card that really improves the archetype, I'm going to say no. Next up, we have yet another card that is very Goalgari in every way. Casting cost, theme, value orientation, it's a kill spell, it's all very Goalgari. It's even got the Vraska flavor text, but this card is just too slow. Like, yes, it's a 2-for-1, we get to kill something, and we get to ramp. Turn 4 at the earliest is way too slow for that to matter. Way too slow for that to matter. So, I have seen a person or two asking about this card. I like the fact that their heads are looking where their heads at. They're looking for the 2-for-1, they're looking for the value, but this is just way too slow to qualify for our purposes. Speaking of value and of 2-for-1 or perhaps 5-for-1 potential, we have Casualties of War. Now, it's very easy to imagine the best case scenario for this card. They've got a little bit of everything on the field, you're on the ropes, but even though they've got a little bit of everything, they're somehow still not really killing you and not locking you out, and they're not empty-handed. In other words, this will almost never happen. and then you get to just top deck your Casualties of War, and you have 6 mana, and you just 5-for-1 them, and it's a beautiful thing. Let's just say that is absolutely not likely. And even if you're against a deck that presents all kinds of targets, like I said, they're probably either killing you or generating enough advantage with, planeswalkers and enchantments and stuff, or they're locking you out somehow that, even in the best case scenarios, this is going to be of limited utility. So, obviously a very tempting card on paper. My advice is to stay well away from it, keep it for the kitchen table, keep it for the Commander games. Next up, we have Finale of Eternity. Now, I think a lot of people have kind of dismissed this card as readily as they and I just dismissed Casualties of War. I would make a case that Finale of Eternity is actually a lot closer to being playable than Casualties, and specifically what occurs to me is if this X corresponded to converted mana cost rather than toughness, then we could be realistically hitting multiple creatures out of Aether Vial decks, even if they are tribal decks with Anthems. We could be hitting multiple Shadows, so on and so forth. Then again, it would be even worse against the Delve threats, but you're not realistically killing a Gurmag Angler with this, even as is, right? So, it would even be decent in the mid-range mirrors, killing a couple 2-drops for, a few 2-drops for 4, if that was converted mana cost, but again, as things stand, I do not believe this card is playable, but it is worth mentioning that, because I think some people will try to play it, and also worth noting that if this was corresponded to CMC, that would actually be kind of interesting. If X is 10 or more, second half of the card does not apply to us at all, so we're just looking at the first line, and based on that first line, and based on toughness, we're going to have to go with a pass. Final card that I am advising my followers to stay away from is the Elder Spell. Now, we have all been there, my friends. I know it as well as you do. We've all been there where it's just agonizing as Jace and Teferi both take up and just inevitably get you out of the game, but you kind of can't scoop for whatever reason, so you're just like, man, wouldn't it be nice to kill both of these guys with one spell? Well, the Elder Spell can do that, that's true. Or maybe you have a Super Friends deck at your LGS and, the Super Friends guy loses to combo every week. But he has game against you because you're curving out. Traditionally, you're playing interaction, and they can just keep top-decking Planeswalkers and eventually bury you in value. And you just feel like, why? Why don't I have Elder Spell to just kill your whole board? So, don't get me wrong. If Super Friends got you down at your local gaming store and you want to troll them, yeah, play an Elder Spell in your sideboard. That's totally fun. That's totally fine. But as a realistic, modern power level answer, this is not it. Again, much like some of the other spells here, where it's easy to imagine the best case scenario, but a way more common scenario is that you will side this in against a deck that plays some number of Planeswalkers, and half the time it will just be dead in hand, and the other half it's just trading 1-for-1. Any number of target Planeswalkers, absolute best case scenario for this, again, maybe accepting like a dedicated Super Friends deck as you bring it in against blue-white control, and they've got turn 4 Jace into turn 5 Teferi, and you happen to have your Elder Spell in hand, and you happen to get it to somehow resolve, which is all very unlikely. You still haven't even really 2-for-1 them, because they have brainstormed with Jace, they have drawn with Teferi. You're still behind on resources, even if your Elder Spell lines up perfectly. That's just the nature of Planeswalkers. They are just so resource positive from the outset that the Elder Spell is not actually that good of a catch-up card, even when it lines up perfectly, which again, it will not the vast majority of the time. So, is this a good answer spell in Limited? Yeah, probably. There's a million Planeswalkers flying around. Is this good in Standard? I don't play Standard. Maybe. I don't know. But for Modern, this card, while very, very cool, and while I understand the incentive to just want to wipe out all the Planeswalkers, we've all been there, this is definitely a card that we should still have a hard pass on, in my opinion. Alright, my friends, so on to the cards that I do think are playable. The first one we're going to talk about is also the most obvious one. This is Lilianas Triumph. This seems like it was tailor-made for us. If you watch my Horizons hype video from a couple weeks ago, 3 of my top 10 wishlist cards for green-black midrange that are realistic candidates to come from older formats into modern via Horizons were Edict effects. We had Diabolic Edict, we had Chainer's Edict, and we had Innocent Blood on there. And Liliana's Triumph is clearly the most powerful out of all of those. Now, it's not actually strictly better than any of them, because you have, of course, Innocent Blood only costs 1 mana. You have the ability with the other edicts, with Diabolic and with Chainers, to target your own creature, which is relevant if our Bobs need to go. If our Bobs are doing a little bit too much work for us. And of course, Chainer's Edict has flashback as well. So Liliana's Triumph is not strictly better than any top-tier existing Edict option. However, I think it is clearly the most powerful of the bunch, namely because not only is it instant speed for 2 mana, which is where we want it to be, it also says each opponent, not target opponent, so it gets around Leyline of Sanctity, which is very important for our nemesis, the Bogles deck. And beyond that, it has an upside. If you control Liliana Planeswalker, each opponent also discards a card. So unlike with the Elder spell, with the loyalty counters on a Planeswalker you control, which is really, really win more in light of how hard it is to make this card good in the first place, Liliana's Triumph is not as win more. It's not as win more as it looks, because yes, if you get everything to line up, the opponent gets 2 for 1. It's great. You have an out to the creature, they discard a card, it's awesome. You have a Liliana on the field already, you're probably going to win that game. But the big incentive, the big reason it's not purely win more, is that even when the Edict effect is kind of dead, you can use this as kind of a build your own funeral charm if you have a Liliana around. You can draw step, just discard them. Like, even if the Edict is not relevant, you can just draw step, cast a discard spell for 2 mana here at instant speed. Pretty cool. Pretty cool. So, we're super hyped for this card, no question about it. I am surprised and pleased that they printed a card, an almost strictly better Diabolic Edict. Again, it's not exactly better, strictly better, but it is close enough that we can call it almost strictly better. So, that said, I having said all that, want to pump the brakes on this card a little bit, because it's questionable how much we really need an Edict format in Modern. Of course there is Bogles, of course this is spectacular there, no question about that. Beyond that, it is good against the combo decks that are like breaching out an Emrakul or cheating out an early Gristlebrand, it can play there. And it can also play, seems pretty good in the mid-range mirrors to me, especially the 2 for 1 potential there is really nice. Just the Edict effect alone is probably fine unless you're against like Abzan with Lingering Souls. And, it's also fine against the non-hyper linear creature decks. If you're against a deck that likes to curve out, maybe it's a Collected Company value deck, maybe it's a Ether Vial deck that plays traditionally on the curve like Eldrazi Taxes or something like that, Merfolk, Liliana's Triumph can be fine there. It's a fine addition to the rest of your removal suite. So it's a fine card in Modern, but this is not Legacy. We don't have True Name Nemesis yet, hopefully ever, running around. We don't have Merit Lage. We don't have the absolute requisite deck building inclusion of an Edict effect. We don't need it. We don't strictly need it. So I think it's playable. I think it's good. I think I'm going to try it as a one-of, probably in my sideboard to begin with. But I want to pump the brakes on this card, just realizing that in many cases, our other removal options might still just be better. So I think it's a 1 to 2 of right now. I'm personally leaning to 1 of. And here's the good news, though. It's a tool that we don't currently have access to an acceptable modern power level version of. The closest is Geth's Verdict, which is fine, but double black is a little tough on curve for us sometimes. So it's definitely an improvement to what's currently in our toolbox, and the more powerful Modern becomes over time, the more useful and necessary Liliana's Triumph will become. Whether it be just because the Modern card pool grows and we need more answers like this, or whether it be because they directly port some of the legacy reasons people play Diabolic Edict into Modern. Either way, it is very good that we have this card at our disposal, and those are my thoughts on it. Next up, we have the card Blast Zone. Now, Blast Zone is really interesting. Super interesting card. Enters with a charge counter. You can tap it for colorless. You can tap it and XX to put X charge counters on Blast Zone. So you're basically paying double +1 for however many counters you want to add on it. Usually, of course, that will be spending 3 mana to add 1 counter. You then also have to spend 3 mana and tap it and sack it to fire it off. And it's basically a build-your-own engineered explosives that does not strictly require the diversity of colors, but also does not have the ability to hit CMC 0 things, which is a big miss compared to EE. That said, it's also better in our green-black rock deck than EE at hitting things at the CMC 3 level or above, which we cannot do outside of really corner case scenarios like a Blood Moon down, but we still have basic Swamp and basic Forest. Then we can make CMC an EE on 3. But this can reach to CMC 3 and beyond, it's just very slow at doing so. That said, we are trying to take the game long. We are trying to grind, we are trying to 2-for-1 or more our opponent. This fits all of those criteria. Here's the problem, it is a colorless land, so we cannot support high numbers of colorless lands, despite the fact that we're only a 2-color deck, because we do have some fairly specific color requirements, including black on turn 1, including double black on turn 3, and the concern for having enough green sources to make our 3 of Scavenging Ooze good, and in general to just kind of cast a Tarmogoyf on turn 2. So the most obvious thing to do if you want to play a Blast Zone is to swap out a Field of Ruin for a Blast Zone, and you haven't made your mana any worse. Well, a little bit worse, because you can't fix your own mana with Blast Zone like you can with Field, but for the most part, you haven't made your mana any worse that way. Here's the big issue, though. I think Field of Ruin is very, very necessary in the current meta. We have a lot of decks, including Tron, that are near the top, where Field is excellent. And is Blast Zone as necessary as Field of Ruin? Definitely not. Is the first Blast Zone as necessary as the third Field of Ruin? Well, that's the big question. I would also say probably not. Right now, my call is that Field number 3 is more important for us than Blast Zone number 1. That said, it is perfectly viable, especially if you have not many big mana decks and a lot of creature decks or other, permanent-based decks at your local store, to play a Blast Zone in place of a Field. That's totally legit, especially for testing purposes. You could also say, alright, I am going to give up equity elsewhere in my mana base. I'm going to play 3 Field and a Blast Zone, but you probably have to make accommodations for that. You probably want to consider Urborg Tomb of Yawgmoth to make all of these colorless lands produce black. You also might need to cut down on like a Treetop Village to produce, to just have more dual lands or fetch lands or whatever you're going to make up the difference with. Maybe a third Overgrown Tomb. These are all good options to make sure you can actually cast your spells. Or you can just get greedy and play 4 colorless sources and 2 Treetop Villages and see where that gets you. I think you'd be only on 16 black sources with that, and in my opinion, that's too low. I think 17 should be the minimum, and 18 is the ideal, right? So, Blast Zone is a card that we can leverage really, really well on paper. In practice, it's going to be hard to accommodate more than one, if even that one, without making a lot of other sacrifices insofar as our mana-based construction is concerned. All that said, this is a really exciting card. It's actually potentially going to be kind of good against us, too, from some of the colorless decks that might try to leverage it, so be warned for that. I guess that's another reason to keep Fields of Ruin in your deck, right? So you can hit this thing before it goes off. But Blast Zone, very, very exciting printing, and I will try to somehow work one of this card into my deck for the purposes of testing, if nothing else, and I think that if we can accommodate it mono-wise, it is a solid and powerful addition to our deck. Last but certainly not least is Ashiok Dreamrender. So Ashiok is one of these uncommon planeswalkers, and I need to take a moment to address the evaluation of those specific type of cards. I think it is very easy to overrate these uncommon walkers. Number one, because to be fair, most of them are 3-drops and a lot of them have very interesting designs. So I'm not disparaging this class of card at all. I'm actually very impressed with how they've designed these planeswalkers in this set. But they're interesting design, they're CMC3, most people really like playing with planeswalkers, so it's very easy to overrate them, and we have to remember not to overrate them because we're used to seeing the card type planeswalker and assuming that, okay, the floor on this card is really high, because if neither deck is really doing much at any given point, you are progressing your planeswalker toward a win condition. It's important to note that Ashiok and similar planeswalkers, that doesn't apply to them. This does not have a +1 ability at all, much less one that advances towards an inevitable win condition like Liliana the Last Hope or Liliana of the Veil does. And most other planeswalkers that ever see play, they have a win condition that is the floor of the card. You can just keep ticking up toward that win con. Ashiok does not have that, so it's important to remember not to overrate the card just because it's a planeswalker. Conceptually, this might be better conceived of as an enchantment. Arguably an easier to kill enchantment as well, because there's probably just as many kill your planeswalker spells as there are kill your enchantment spells. Plus, of course, planeswalkers can be lightning bolted and attacked, right? So, if anything, this is more like a multiple use, like an enchantment with a bunch of charge counters, basically, that can be attacked and bolted. That said, I am still high on the card, and here is why. Let's take a look first at the static ability. Spells and abilities your opponents control cannot cause their controller to search their library. So, we're thinking here of Whir of Invention, Chord of Calling, Amulet Titan, fetch lands in general, Expedition Map for Tron, and of course, Valakut, whether it be Primetime or Scapeshift itself out of the Valakut decks. Ashiok hoses it all. Now, Ashiok will be varying degrees of usefulness against those archetypes. Of course, most fetching is going to happen before turn 3. Expedition maps, if you're not disrupting Tron, will more often than not happen before turn 3. That said, I think Ashiok's passive static ability against Valakut decks alone is enough to make me want to test her. Everything else is pure upside. And of course, turn 3 is usually going to be ahead of Whirs and Chords and other search effects like that. So, Ashiok will hit kind of the latter stage fetches and maps in Sylvan Scryings, and Ashiok will hit most Whirs and Chords, and Ashiok will also, if you play it on curve, always hit the Primeval Titan and the Scapeshift specifically out of Valakut decks. Sometimes Amulet Titan can get a Titan out before that. That's whatever. Again, we want to be disrupting them anyway on turns 1 and 2. So the fact, it's not like you just put an Ashiok in your deck and you're like, okay, the opponent is disrupted. No, we already have to disrupt early. Ashiok is the follow-up disruption, and is arguably the best form of disruption we have access to against specifically Valakut decks. And, of course, Valakut decks are our toughest Tier 1 matchup in the entire format. So, again, between the Valakut deck alone and all the upsides that passive ability has against all the other tech I mentioned and then some, I am very high on Ashiok's static ability. But that's not all. Target player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard, then exile each opponent's graveyard. So, this is kind of a repeatable Tormod's Crypt, repeated up to 5 times. Again, will it be sufficient alone against Dredge? Most of the time it won't be. But we are supposed to be disrupting them from turn 1 anyway against Dredge. Whether it's with a Spellbomb on turn 1, or a Surgical in our hand, or even discard on turn 1 is often pretty good against Dredge. Whether it's a Scooz on 2, we're supposed to be doing things early in that game anyway. So it's not like Ashiok is going to single-handedly win us the game, but if we slow them down and disrupt them enough, Ashiok can exile their graveyard up to 5 times. That's amazing. That's amazing as kind of a follow-up form of disruption. And also, remember that we play cards like Nile Spellbomb instead of Relic of Progenitus for a reason. We don't want our own graveyard touched. We want to hose the opponent's graveyard only. We want ours to stick around for the purposes of Tarmogoyf and other effects. So, Ashiok does that. Ashiok is one-sided graveyard hate. And, on top of everything else I just said, it is a Planeswalker. So, if it gets to the graveyard, that's just another unusual type for Tarmogoyf to grow. We're already having a mana base oriented toward casting a double black Planeswalker on turn 3, so Ashiok does not warp our mana base in any other ways. And yeah, I'm very, very excited about all of this. So again, is Ashiok going to revolutionize our archetype? Maybe not so much, but and I don't think it's probably more than a one of. But I am more confident about this being good as a one-of right now in the current meta, in my current deck, in the sideboard, than I am about even Lilianas Triumph, and also than I am about Blast Zone. So that's how high I am on Ashiok. Again, only a one-of, sideboard material, but having a lot to do against all of those decks and all those effects that I just mentioned means that we should be pretty excited about Ashiok Dreamrender. Alright, my friends, so that has been the Grimflayer's rundown of War of the Spark and what spoilers you can expect to best avoid and what spoilers you can expect to be functional pieces in our deck. This was not a set where we got something like Assassin's Trophy that's going to be a 3 or 4 of in our deck, but we do have some really interesting tools. So I hope you enjoyed the rundown. Of course, if you disagree with anything, or if you want to bring something to my attention that I did not cover, I would love to hear your thoughts, or even if you just agree with everything I said. I never mind hearing that either. So, thank you so much for watching. Welcome once again to our newest patron, the Inquisitor Ken. And if you out there would like to support this content and see it grow, you can consider supporting me on Patreon. I do offer tier rewards, and also liking, sharing, commenting, and subscribing is a good way to help this get more exposure. Go check out my Goalgari Highlander League. That was all kinds of fun. And until then, I will talk to you next time. I hope you have a great day. And yeah, we'll see you for some more League play soon.